The sun had barely risen over the skyline, casting long shadows over the crumbling remains of what was once a thriving metropolis. In the early morning hours, everything was eerily quiet. The streets were deserted, save for the faint sound of a distant, haunting growl. There had been rumors of strange occurrences in the city for weeks, but it wasn't until that fateful night, when the first wave of the infection hit, that everything had changed. Now, the world was fighting for its very existence. It started with a virus, a mutation, a virus so contagious and aggressive that it spread like wildfire. One bite, one scratch, one drop of infected blood, and a person was turned. At first, the government insisted it was under control, a simple outbreak. But the truth was darker than anyone had imagined. The infected, now nothing more than soulless shells of their former selves, roamed the streets in search of the living, hungry for human flesh. Inside the makeshift barricades of a once secure government facility, a ragtag group of survivors held their ground. Among them was Captain Elena Martinez, a seasoned military officer who had seen combat across the globe. With dark circles under her eyes and a mind sharp from years of tactical experience, Elena was determined to protect the last remnants of humanity. She had witnessed the horror firsthand, the initial wave, the chaos, the desperation. She was not about to let this be the end. In the command center, Elena stood before a large digital map, her fingers tracing the screen as she read through the latest updates. The infection had spread beyond containment zones. Cities had fallen, nations had crumbled, and now the survivors were facing their greatest challenge, an all-out assault by the undead. "Report," Elena said, her voice steady but laced with urgency. Lieutenant Harris, the communications officer, turned to her with a grim look on his face. "The northern front has fallen. We've lost contact with multiple defense points. It's spreading faster than we can reinforce." Elena's hand clenched into a fist. She had always been a woman of action, but the weight of the situation was beginning to settle in. "How long do we have?" "We've got hours, maybe less," Harris replied, his voice faltering. "The horde is on its way." Outside, the roar of distant gunfire echoed through the air, followed by the unmistakable sounds of screams. Elena's heart sank. Every minute counted. She turned to face the survivors who had gathered around the room, each of them looking to her for guidance. The gravity of the situation was not lost on anyone. "We hold the line," she said, her voice unwavering. "We fight or we die trying." Just as she finished speaking, a loud crash reverberated through the building. The sound of shuffling footsteps grew louder, followed by guttural moans. Elena's eyes snapped to the door, and the survivors rushed to their stations, gripping rifles and preparing for the worst. The first infected burst through the door, eyes glazed over with hunger. It was a grotesque thing, skin torn, body decomposing. It moved with unnatural speed and violence, but it was no match for the trained soldiers in the room. Elena didn't hesitate. With a swift motion, she drew her sidearm and took down the creature with a single shot to the head. But that was just the beginning. More followed, swarming into the building with relentless fury. The survivors fought back fiercely, but there were too many. The horde seemed endless, pushing their way through the defenses like an unstoppable tide. Elena's mind raced. They were going to be overwhelmed if they didn't act fast. "To the escape tunnels," she shouted, her voice rising above the chaos. "Move now." The survivors scrambled for the exit, abandoning their posts and making their way down into the dimly lit corridors beneath the facility. Elena stayed at the rear, firing at any infected that came too close. Her thoughts raced, but she kept her focus sharp. There was no time for hesitation. As they descended into the underground tunnels, Elena's mind flickered back to her family, her young daughter, Sophia. She'd been forced to leave her behind when the outbreak began. Sophia's face haunted her thoughts, but she had no choice. Survival came first. If she could just get the survivors to safety, maybe, just maybe, there would be hope. The last of the group filed into the tunnel, and Elena slammed the heavy metal door shut behind them, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The tunnel was dark, but it offered a temporary sanctuary. It wasn't much, but it was enough to buy them time. Elena paused, catching her breath and listening for any signs of the infected. The horde hadn't followed them. Yet. They had to move fast. As they made their way deeper into the tunnels, Elena's mind raced with plans, but a single thought pierced through all the noise. How much longer could they last? The world above was crumbling, and the battle for survival had only just begun. The darkness of the underground tunnels swallowed them whole, and every step echoed ominously off the cold, concrete walls. Elena led the group, her mind calculating their next move with precision. The escape tunnels, once a symbol of safety, now felt like a graveyard. The air was thick with tension, and the only sounds were the steady footsteps of the survivors and the occasional soft groan from behind the metal door they had slammed shut. "How far to the safe zone?" Lieutenant Harris asked, his voice hushed as if the very walls could hear him. Elena didn't look back as she continued to lead them deeper into the bowels of the facility. She'd memorized the map, but now it seemed like it had been years since she'd last looked at it. "We've got about 2 miles to go. Stay close." The survivors, tired and grim-faced, followed her without question. Among them was Sarah, a former scientist who had managed to adapt quickly to the chaos, and Marcus, a young man with no military training, but an unyielding desire to survive. They had formed an unlikely bond during the early days of the outbreak, and their trust in Elena was unspoken but absolute. Elena's mind constantly raced, analyzing every potential threat. The infected were relentless, but they had a weakness: sound. They were drawn to noise. The more they made, the more the horde would come. As the group moved deeper into the tunnel, Elena's senses were on high alert. The hairs on the back of her neck prickled with the feeling that they were being watched. But there was nothing but the dark silence that pressed in around them like a suffocating weight. Suddenly, a screeching sound broke through the stillness. A high-pitched, unnatural noise that made the survivors flinch. Elena's heart pounded as she whipped around, her weapon drawn. "What the hell was that?" Marcus whispered, his face pale. "I don't know," Elena muttered, scanning the darkness. "But it's not the usual growl." Before anyone could react, the sound echoed again, closer this time. A low rumble beneath their feet sent a jolt of panic through the group. Elena held up her hand for silence. Her mind raced with possibilities, but none of them were good. Whatever was down here, it wasn't just the usual infected. "We need to move," Elena said, her voice sharp, "and we need to move fast." But just as they began to move again, there was another noise, louder, more intense. The ground beneath them shook, and with it, a wall of rubble suddenly crashed down ahead, blocking their path. Dust filled the air, and Elena staggered backward, raising her arm to shield her face. "Trap," Sarah gasped, her voice cracking. Elena gritted her teeth. They were trapped. There was no way through the rubble, and the tunnel behind them felt like it was closing in. The sounds of shuffling footsteps in the distance were growing louder, the unmistakable moans of the infected drawing closer. "Look for another exit," Elena shouted. "Now." But it was too late. From the shadows emerged a group of infected, far more terrifying than anything they had encountered before. These weren't the stumbling, mindless walkers. They were fast. Their eyes glowed with an eerie hunger, and their movements were agile, as if the virus had altered their physiology beyond what was normal. These were not just zombies. They were something else entirely. "They're smarter," Marcus yelled, panicking. Elena's heart raced. These creatures were different, more dangerous. She had no time to think. "Form a perimeter," she shouted. "Sarah, Marcus, stay close." But the infected didn't give them a chance to react. They charged, moving with terrifying speed, their claws outstretched, and their mouths snapping hungrily. The survivors opened fire, but the creatures were too quick, darting in and out of cover, forcing the group to retreat further into the darkness. Elena fired off rounds, taking down one of the creatures, but it was only a temporary reprieve. A screech ripped through the tunnel, and Elena turned just in time to see a monstrous figure emerge from the shadows, a hulking, deformed creature far larger than the others. Its skin was mottled and torn, with patches of muscle exposed. It seemed to move with purpose, its red eyes locking onto Elena. "Get back." Elena screamed, shoving Sarah and Marcus behind her as the massive infected lunged. The creature's arms were like tree trunks, reaching for her with frightening strength. With a roar, Elena emptied her clip into its chest, but the creature barely flinched. It swiped at her, sending her crashing into the wall. The world spun around her, but before she could recover, the massive creature was upon her, its claws aiming for her throat. Suddenly, a gunshot rang out, sharp, clean, and the beast staggered back with a howl, its chest ripped open. Elena blinked through the haze of pain as Marcus stepped forward, shaking with fear, but holding a rifle in his hands. "I got it," he stammered, his voice barely audible. Elena stood, wiping blood from her forehead. "Good job, Marcus," she said, her voice low but full of pride. "But don't let your guard down." The remaining infected were still coming, and the walls seemed to close in on them. They had to keep moving. Elena turned to the survivors. "We're not out of this yet. Stay together." They moved quickly, pushing forward through the wreckage, but the sound of infected growls echoed louder now, closer than ever before. It was only a matter of time before they were surrounded. The world outside seemed to have ended, and down here, in the darkness of the tunnels, survival was becoming more of a distant hope with every passing minute. The deeper they ventured into the tunnel system, the more oppressive the air became. The stale, musty scent of decay mixed with the acrid smell of sweat and fear. Every step felt like it might be their last, and the weight of the situation pressed heavily on Elena's chest. The survivors had moved as quickly as possible, but the tunnel seemed endless, and the sounds of the infected growing nearer made it feel like the walls were closing in on them. Despite their best efforts, the horde wasn't far behind. They had managed to take down a few of the faster infected, but the relentless swarm wasn't slowing down. They needed a plan, and fast. "How much farther, Elena?" Sarah asked, her voice shaky but desperate. Her eyes darted nervously toward the rear of the group, where the faint glow of flashlight beams showed the dark shadows growing closer. "We can't keep running forever." Elena gritted her teeth, her hand on the wall to steady herself. The tunnel ahead bent to the left, and she could just make out a small crack of light coming from the end. She pushed forward with determination, not daring to slow down. "We're almost there," Elena said, but even as she spoke, she could feel the weight of uncertainty gnawing at her. Behind them, the shrill, unnatural screech of the infected echoed through the tunnel, growing louder, more ferocious. They were gaining. "We need to make a stand," Marcus said, his voice filled with fear, but also determination. His hands were trembling as he checked the ammo in his rifle, his expression one of grim resolve. "We can't outrun them." Elena's eyes flickered toward him. "What do you suggest?" He looked around at the small group, Sarah, Harris, and Marcus himself. The four of them were the last of the original team, and now they stood alone in a maze of tunnels with no way out. The others were lost, victims of the horde or scattered in the chaos of the fight. They were the last hope. "We fight," Marcus said, his voice growing steadier as he spoke. "We make them come to us. We use the tunnels against them." Elena considered his words. There was no other choice. She had to trust them now. "All right," Elena said, her voice firm. "We set up here. We make our stand. Harris, you get to the far end of the tunnel. Sarah, help me reinforce the barricades. Marcus, get your rifle ready. We need to hold them back as long as we can." The group quickly moved into position. Harris ran to the far side of the tunnel, setting up a makeshift barricade with debris they'd pulled from the walls. Elena and Sarah worked together, pushing broken pipes and rubble into place, while Marcus took a defensive stance, scanning the approaching darkness. Elena took a deep breath, her pulse quickening as she checked her sidearm and assault rifle. Her mind was focused, but every instinct in her body screamed that this might be their final stand. She glanced over her shoulder one last time at the survivors, people who had been strangers only days ago, now bound by shared pain, survival, and a will to fight until the end. "We can do this," Elena said, though she wasn't sure if she believed it herself. A heavy silence fell over them as the sounds of the infected grew louder. Their guttural moans, once distant, were now deafening. Then, from the dark expanse of the tunnel, a single figure stumbled into the dim light, the first infected to appear. It was a grotesque creature, its skin torn and hanging in shreds, its eyes milky white with the madness of the infection. It stumbled forward, its rotting limbs twitching erratically. And behind it, more followed. A swarm of them. Hundreds. The darkness seemed to shift as they poured into the tunnel. "Steady," Elena murmured, her hand gripping her rifle. The others raised their weapons in unison. The infected came at them like a flood, an unstoppable tide of flesh and hunger. Elena fired the first shot, a clean shot that took down the lead infected with precision. But the wave kept coming, relentlessly, crashing into the barricade with horrifying force. The survivors fired again and again, picking off the infected one by one, but their numbers were overwhelming. Then the ground shook, and the tunnel vibrated with the impact of something massive slamming into the walls. Elena's heart skipped a beat. She looked up to see a hulking figure, the same monstrous creature that had attacked them before. It had followed them, and now it was here, snarling in fury as it battered its way through the barricades with terrifying strength. "We can't hold them back much longer," Sarah shouted over the noise of the battle, her voice hoarse with fear. "We need to get out of here." But Elena's mind was already racing. There was no way they could outrun the creatures. They would be trapped. They had to find a way to break the horde. "We fight," Elena repeated, louder this time, determination surging through her. "Fight for your lives, for the world. This ends here." She looked to Marcus, who was already taking careful aim at the oncoming wave of infected. She could see his resolve hardening, his earlier fear now replaced with fierce survival instinct. Sarah was reloading her weapon, eyes locked on the front lines. Harris was shouting into the communication system, trying to call for backup, but the signal was weak. Elena took a deep breath and braced herself as the first infected reached the barricades, climbing over the wreckage. They were here. "Hold the line," Elena shouted. "We can make it through this." The survivors fired relentlessly, but as the last of the barricades were breached, it became clear. The final stand had begun. With one last, desperate rallying cry, Elena dove into the fray, her rifle raised and ready. They might not survive this fight, but they would give everything they had to the cause. The battle for humanity was far from over, but in this moment, they were the only ones left to hold the line. The tunnel had become a war zone, a cacophony of gunshots, screams, and the relentless screeching of the infected. Elena, now covered in dirt, blood, and sweat, fired her weapon without pause, each shot more desperate than the last. The barricade were gone, and the survivors were fighting tooth and nail, their bodies and minds pushed to the brink. The massive, mutated creature roared as it bulldozed through the wreckage, and the smaller infected crawled over the debris with terrifying speed, undeterred by the gunfire. "Keep moving," Elena shouted, trying to maintain some semblance of control. Her voice cracked under the pressure, but she couldn't afford to falter. "We can't hold them off forever. We need to make it to the exit." She glanced around at the survivors. Sarah and Marcus were doing their best to fight off the relentless swarm, but fatigue was starting to set in. Harris was barely holding onto his rifle, his hand trembling as he fired at anything that moved. Their ammunition was running low. "I'm out," Marcus shouted, his voice strained. "We're going to be overrun." Elena's eyes darted toward the narrow opening at the far end of the tunnel. The light from the outside world flickered faintly in the distance, just within reach. They had to make it there, or all would be lost. The mutant creature lunged toward them again, its hulking form crashing into the survivor's position with terrifying force. Sarah screamed as she was knocked backward, but she managed to scramble to her feet and keep firing. But the creature wasn't stopping. Elena knew they couldn't keep fighting like this. The tunnel was too small, the walls closing in on them from every side. The infected were everywhere, and their numbers seemed endless. Her mind raced, desperation clawing at her. "We can't die here. Not like this." A sudden thought struck her, a crazy idea, but it was their only chance. The explosives. There had been a stockpile of military-grade explosives at the back of the facility when they had first arrived. It had been too dangerous to use them initially, but now they had no choice. "Cover me," Elena shouted, her voice ringing out above the din of battle. "Are you crazy?" Marcus shouted, but Elena was already moving toward the far end of the tunnel, her eyes locked on the entrance where the explosives had been stored. Before anyone could protest, she dove into the small alcove, pushing aside debris and making her way toward the crates of explosives that had been left behind during the initial evacuation. Her fingers fumbled with the detonator, but she didn't hesitate. This was their last shot. There was no turning back now. Behind her, the horde grew louder, the screeching and growling of the infected reverberating in the narrow space like a death knell. But Elena didn't slow down. She had one mission now, to give them a chance to survive. Her heart pounded as she connected the wires to the detonator, her hand shaking as she activated it. 3 minutes. Get to the exit. Elena screamed over her shoulder, her voice urgent. Run. The survivors didn't hesitate. With only seconds to spare, they turned and ran, heading for the faint light that promised the outside world. Elena followed, but not before giving one last glance at the explosives. If this works, they'll be able to escape. If it doesn't, we die. The sound of the horde closing in made her pulse race. They were almost there. Just a few more feet. Elena reached the end of the tunnel and emerged into the open air, her lungs sucking in the first breath of fresh air they'd had in hours. But the explosion hadn't gone off yet. Move, Elena shouted, pushing them forward, her voice hoarse. She didn't dare look back. And then, the world erupted behind them. The ground shook as the tunnel exploded, sending a shockwave through the air that knocked Elena off her feet. She hit the ground hard but scrambled to her hands and knees, looking back just in time to see the tunnel collapse in a massive cloud of dust and debris. The shockwave had torn apart the infected in the tunnel, and the debris had blocked the entrance. The survivors were stunned, gasping for breath, but they were alive. "Is everyone okay?" Elena asked, her voice hoarse but filled with relief. Marcus, Sarah, and Harris nodded, though their faces were covered in dirt and blood. "We made it," Sarah whispered, disbelief creeping into her voice. "We actually made it." Elena looked out at the horizon, the sun rising slowly in the east, casting a golden light across the wreckage. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself a brief moment of hope. The world had changed, and the road ahead would be long and perilous, but the survivors had a chance. They could rebuild. They could survive. And that was worth fighting for. "Elena," Marcus said softly, his voice full of awe. "We did it. We survived." She looked at him, at Sarah and Harris, and realized that while they had been fighting to stay alive, they had also been fighting for something greater. For humanity. For hope. "We made it," Elena said, her voice steady. "And we're not done yet." As the sun continued to rise, painting the sky with colors of orange and red, the survivors walked toward the unknown, but they walked together. The battle for humanity had just begun, but this time, they weren't facing it alone. And somewhere in the distance, a faint sound broke through the silence. A new threat. But for now, they would rest, recover, and prepare. Because the fight was far from over.